All right. While everybody's taking their seats, I wanted to kind of get us started and just welcome everybody to today's panel. We have a lot of great research together that we're going to go over. I want to introduce Dr. Rene, Rendon, Cory, Yoder, and Kelly Cory. And we're going to dive into, I want to introduce them a little bit, but I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. And this year we have slides as well to walk you through their research, because sometimes it's hard to listen. We're a little bit more tactile, but this way we'll have some slides, also listening, and then we're going to take a lot of questions and answers so that we can ask our panelists about their research. So Dr. Rendon is an associate professor at Naval Postgraduate School. So again, welcome to the Acquisition Research Symposium today. And he's going to be talking to us about partnership intermediary agreements. He's a prolific writer and publisher, and we're looking forward to what his research has revealed. So start thinking about your questions now. And then we have Cory Yoder, who is a senior lecturer and also Naval Postgraduate School professor. Holds multiple degrees in national security, strategic studies, business management, and he is going to talk to us about commercial solutions openings. And so fondly, as CSOs, we're going to have some acronym overload. We got PIAs and CSOs, and then Kelly Cory is contract management area chair. And he is in the Department of Defense Management, also at Naval Postgraduate School, doctoral candidate, and the recipient of the 2021 Future of Pricing Award. So guess what he's going to kind of talk to us about, even though that is not the focus of his research. But that's going to be interesting in government, industry, and academia. And we're going to dive into co-education and its application. So without belaboring getting to our main event here with our research, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rendon. So Rene, can you introduce yourself a little bit and then also tell us about your research?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity for me to present here at this Acquisition Research Symposium. And my name is Rene Rendon, as General Treviño said, and I'm on the faculty here at the Naval Postgraduate School. I teach in the Contract Management degree program under the Acquisition Sciences area. Prior to coming to the Naval Postgraduate School, I spent 22 plus years in the Air Force as a contracting officer, working on major weapon systems, aircraft, space systems, satellite programs as well. So that's my background. My research today has to do with partnership intermediary agreements. And that's a hard word for me to say, so I'm just going to say PIA because it flows better. So my research is on PIAs and the analysis of effective practices in the Global Strike Command. And so I want to make sure my slides are up there. My lead author is an Air Force retired contracting officer and agreements officer, Allan Cameron. And he's also one of the alumni from our degree program here. So Allan has direct real-world experience working PIAs at the Air Force Global Strike Command in Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. And a lot of this research is based on his field work and his personal experience, real-world experience working PIAs. And so I don't know if Allan is online. He wasn't able to make it here for the symposium. Now that he's retired from the Air Force, he has to do real work, and he has a real job, and so he has those types of responsibilities. So anyway, in terms of the research, in terms of the background, we all know that the majority of DoD procurements are structured using FAR-based contracts. However, some agencies are authorized to use non-FAR instruments as a way of acquiring innovative, agile, and more collaborative solutions in a more timelier manner. And one of those non-FAR instruments is what we call the PIA, the Partnership Intermediary Agreement. And so DoD overall, and specifically the Air Force, has been very, very successful in using PIAs. However, there's some challenges with using PIAs. First of all, not too many people know about them. They don't, and since they are non-FAR instruments, not a lot of contracting officers and or agreements officers are very knowledgeable of how PIAs work and the processes for managing PIAs. In addition to that, there's a lack of best practices or identified best practices and lessons learned and successful use cases, as well as the dissemination of all of that information to other agencies within the DoD, as well as the federal government. So with that background, I'd like to just spend some time discussing what a PIA is. And so to set the stage for the research presentation, just a few background points on PIAs, because the research is not necessarily on the intricacies of the PIAs, but more on the best practices and lessons learned. So PIAs are non-FAR-based instruments used to acquire technology, transfer, and transition services, what we call T3, technology, transfer, and transition. And so what this means is that PIAs sought to seek long-term relationships between the federal government and industry in transferring technology, which is going from DoD to industry, and transitioning technology going from industry back to DoD. And I think I have a slide here that reflects that. So a lot of PIAs are originated from federal laboratories. So the Air Force Research Lab, AFRL, pretty much manages or establishes all of the PIAs within the Air Force. And like I said, the purpose of the PIAs are to establish long-term relationships between the federal government, and as you see in this slide, you have the federal lab, between the federal government, such as a federal lab, a state or local government or a nonprofit entity, and that entity would be known as the Partnership Intermediary, the PI. So now we have two acronyms, the PIA, the agreement itself, and the PI, and I'll refer to the Partnership Intermediary as the PI. And so there's the relationship between the government and the PI. The PI also has relationships with academia and with industry. And so the PI is like the broker that establishes the relationship between the federal government that needs technology transfer as well as transition, and with industry that also supports and participates in technology transfer and transition. Once again, transfer is DoD to industry, and transition is from industry to the federal government. In addition to that, only contracting officers, only warranted contracting officers or agreements officers are authorized to sign PIAs that obligate funds. So the PIA, as I said, serves as the broker and facilitates partnerships between the federal government and industry. So now that that is set, let's go to my, well, before I get to the research methodology, this just quickly shows you all of the different PIAs that the AFRL, Air Force Research Lab, has established across the United States. Some of these, the ones that you see the little green mark, are the ones that are DoD level PIAs, and then the other ones are the Air Force levels. The ones I'm going to focus on, the specific one I'm going to focus on is the one in Louisiana with the Cyber Innovation Center, which serves as the PI for the PIA that is the basis for our research. And so our research approach here is the purpose of the research is to identify effective practices in the use of PIAs within the Air Force, specifically looking at the Air Force Global Strike Command PIA that they have with the Cyber Innovation Center. The research question, very, very easy, very simple. What are the effective practices in the use of PIAs that will foster innovation, maximize collaborative outcomes, and achieve considerable return on investment? And so this is an exploratory study as well as a case study because what we're doing is we're reviewing the literature. We're reviewing what's in the literature in terms of policies and reports and other research products, and comparing that with what we find in place in the real world at Barksdale Air Force Base, the home of the Air Force Global Strike Command, and their PIA with the Cyber Innovation Center as the PI. So our focus, it's a case study, Air Force Global Strike Command and the Cyber Innovation Center, comparing the literature, what the literature says, what the theory says, with real-world application. As I said, my lead author spent many years at Air Force Global Strike Command, Barksdale Air Force Base in Bossier City, Louisiana, and as the agreements officer for this PIA with the CIC. So there's another acronym, the Cyber Innovation Center. So methodology, as I mentioned before, examining congressional statutes. I won't get into all of the different authorities that we used that authorize PIAs. So we're looking at the literature, and then we're synthesizing that with direct insights acquired by Allan, who has 11 years of practitioner experience working on the Global Strike Command, CIC PIA. So that's the methodology, and then based on our findings, so these are our findings, and I hope these aren't too hard to read. So we identified 5 areas of effective practices, and those practices include, number 1, sharing of information. And if you see on the chart on the left, so the first column is the practice, and underneath are all of the references, the citations that we found in the literature for that effective practice. So sharing of information, and then on the right, we see how this was applied at the Air Force Global Strike Command. So the CIC provides a platform through its collaborative environment. So this is a brick and mortar structure at the National Cyber Research Park in Bossier City, Louisiana. Air Force Global Strike Command has infused the CIC into its Science and Technology Department there, or the Office of the Chief Scientist at Barksdale Air Force Base at the headquarters Global Strike Command. So this is one example of how sharing of information is being done in this specific PIA. Standardized contracting processes is the second effective practice. And so PIAs are different because they're not FAR-based instruments. So it's still contracting, but it's not FAR-based contracting. So this has proved to be a challenge for many agreements officers, even if they're seasoned FAR-based contracting officers, FAR-trained contracting officers. The wide breadth of differentiation between CPDs, which is collaborative project designs, and the CPO, the collaborative project orders, is one of the areas that creates unfamiliarity concerning the contracting process. If you think of a PIA in this instance, if you think of a PIA as an IDIQ contract, and instead of a task order, you have a CPD, a collaborative process design, a CPD that falls under the CPO, the collaborative project order. The CPO would be the IDIQ contract. The CPD would be the task order. So I'm speaking in terms of FAR for those of you that are FAR-trained contracting officers. That's how it relates. The third effective practice is the location of the partner, location of the PI, the partnership intermediary. The closer the proximity between the PI and the government entity proves to be more successful in enabling successful outcomes. And the CIC is located 17 miles from Barksdale Air Force Base, which is the headquarters for the MAJCOM. So the close proximity facilitates technical transfer and transition, and also enhances the collaborative environment. The fourth effective practice, metrics. Just like in regular FAR-based contracts, we need to monitor and measure our performance metrics. And just some words there, I'm not going to read the whole slide there or the whole square, but the measuring of the success of the PIA, specifically the measuring the success of each CPD, collaborative project design, the outcomes of that performance, and then acknowledging and sharing the outcomes with the other stakeholders is very important. And then finally, the last one, lessons learned and after action reports. DoD-wide, I believe, my opinion, we're not really good at documenting lessons learned. We're definitely not really good at documenting after action reports. Not all after action reports look the same. So documenting the lessons learned and the after action reports are essential to gauge the effectiveness and outcomes of the PIAs. And as I said before, one of the deficiencies in using PIAs is not everybody in DoD knows how they work or how they can be successful. And if we can more effectively document what works and what doesn't work, lessons learned and after action reports, we can spread and further disseminate the benefits of using PIAs. And just a lot of that is what I've already, a lot of what's on the slides is what I've already discussed. The importance of effective communication between members of the government and the PI team, streamlined contracting processes, enabling the government to have a higher likelihood of achieving efficient administrative implementation and execution of the PIAs. I think an area for further research would be, does being a seasoned, trained FAR contracting officer inhibit understanding PIAs and effectively managing PIAs? Don't know, that's a further area for research. And the proximity of the location of the PI to the government acquisition team is a significant enabler. In addition to that, continuous monitoring and measurement of the PIA is critical for optimizing the efficiency, tracking the progress, and so forth. And then finally, lessons learned and after action reports are necessary to gauge the effectiveness of the PIA, as well as to refine future project design and outcomes. And then, so recommendations, we always have recommendations based on our research. The fielding of technology derived from the PIA must provide continuity between the stakeholders at each stage of the contracting process to ensure the transfer of these technological solutions and outcomes, as well as the government usability on future acquisitions, resulting in cost savings. And if you get into the paper lists identifies some cost savings and new solutions for Global Strike Command. Streamlined contracting processes must provide a transparent roadmap. This may be an area for further education and training for agreements officers. And then proximity is a driving factor for facilitating collaborative and more efficient outcomes. And then I believe this is my last slide. The acquisition team must ensure awareness or maintain awareness and knowledge of tracking and reporting the metrics. This includes monitoring and collaborating on the PI's monthly and quarterly financial compliance statements. So understanding how to read industry financial statements is very important. And then finally, the government and the PI should establish and enhance after-action reports, metrics, and deliverables to evaluate the success of the PIAs, and more importantly, to communicate that success throughout the defense industry and throughout all of DoD. And I believe that's my last slide. And I'll pass it over to Professor Yoder, and he can discuss CSOs. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cory Yoder. I'm an instructor and senior lecturer at the Naval Postgraduate School. I've been there for 24 years. I came in as a military faculty member and then took a civilian position. I was there a long time ago with Dave Lamb, and I was a student of Dave Lamb's back in the 90s. My background, I'm a retired Navy commander. I've done a lot of expeditionary support, industrial support, contracting, and have done quite a bit of research in the areas of FAR Part 15 type acquisitions, innovative processes, since I've been an instructor here. I really enjoy it. So I'm gonna give a little bit of a background here. But first, and I can send anybody these slides if you want to see some more detail, but I wanted to talk about the background of CSOs and kind of the definition and how it applies and where they emanated from. They're not that old. They got their start in 2018 as a pilot program. And it's important to recognize that when we institute new pilot programs and then they become more permanent, Not a lot of people know how to use them. They can be challenging. Hey, what authority do I really have? How do I exercise that authority? I want to walk down the path of utilizing these new tools because we've been begging for them. But am I going to get myself in trouble if I step into this arena? So I kind of want to be a cheerleader for this, in the sense that I think we've got a really powerful tool here that may not be well known and may not be understood in how do we get this in use and in play. So what is CSO? CSO was initiated under Section 813, actually in the 2017 under Section 880 of the NDAA. And it's been updated several times in subsequent NDAAs, and it became permanent under Section 803 in FY22. And then the DFARS 212.70 actually has the implementation instructions, and I'm going to tell you, it's an easy read. It's about a page and a half. So the instructions on what this is and how to do it, very clear, very informative, but not a lot of proscriptive detail. Proscriptive meaning that they're actually giving us a bazillion rules and regulations to follow. So I think it's kind of an answer to something that we've all been begging for, and that is, how do we get a simplified type process in play without a lot of rules and regulations that's going to allow us to access innovative solutions to our vexing problems. So how does it get used? The KO can use CSOs to obtain innovative solutions or potential capabilities that fulfill requirements, to close capability gaps, or provide potential innovative technological advancements, when meaningful proposals with associated technical or scientific approaches are anticipated. Yeah, these are my preamble slides, which I'll give to people later if they want them. So how does the CSO define innovation? It's defined in the DFARS as any technological process or method, including research and development, that's new as of the date of the submission of the proposal. So, as a requirements generator, as an entity, or a contracting officer who's facilitating those requirements generation, this is a tool in a toolkit that, if we examine that and examine the markets and the nature of the problem, might be something that we offer to as a solution set. It also includes any application that's new as of the date of submission of a proposal for a method or process as of that submission date. And one caveat is, and this is in the DFARS, if this action is going to be over $100 million, we have to ask for procurement executive approval prior to using it. That could slow it down a little bit, but again, in most cases not. Now, I want to emphasize again, this is a purposely broad definition, and for those of us who are old enough to remember FARA and FASA, the streamlining acts that came in the mid-late 1990s, the definition of commercial item was purposely broad because they wanted to sweep in as many new entrants into the market as they could. And this is no different. As I read the DFARS and study this, I see this being the same thing. It's purposely a wide aperture to allow us to bring in commercial industries, sometimes that are non-FAR based, in to help solve our problems. So CSOs are simple in their construct. This enables rapid selection of innovative commercial solutions, and that construct is real easy to understand. Description of the agency's interest for an individual program requirement for a broadly defined area of interest, and I'll emphasize, there's no requirement for performance work statement or a statement of work. And so those of us who have done those before and just spent weeks crafting them and making sure they're right, because we're going to get what we ask for. Sometimes if we don't ask for it right, we're going to get something that's not fitting. Second thing is a list of proposal instructions, and this is a very truncated list. What do we need to see from that potential company? And last, a description of the evaluation factors to be used by the agencies. And unlike FAR Part 15 protocols, this just lists kind of a hierarchy and allows subject matter experts on our team to perform the actual evaluation against the criteria that we've established. And so very, very streamlined compared to traditional FAR Part 15 protocol. What do we need to consider? They definitely have more flexibility, and that's one of the reasons we like them. And quick selection is a hallmark if we construct them right. They theoretically can save time because we don't have to do a lot of front-end work in crafting the SOW performance work statement. And we can craft more flexible evaluation criteria than we might do under a FAR Part 15. One of the hallmarks that's brought out in the DFARS is there's no need to establish a competitive range prior to engaging in discussions. So how many people have gone through that down select, and then you have to debrief those officers and to go through all that? It's time consuming, it's manpower intensive, it adds to transaction cost. This can eliminate some of that. It sounds similar to a broad agency announcement, with the distinction that CSO acquires commercial solutions for any nature of vexing problem, including service issues, where a BAA is limited to basic and applied research and the constraints of the funding that goes along with that. These CSOs are not limited to using a FAR-based contract for award. You can actually move into the OT arena and use that protocol. So, and that's the question that comes up: is this a solicitation method or is it a contracting method? Technically, CSO is a solicitation method, which can result either in a traditional-based contract award or an OT, for example. Another factor: CSOs may be protested. However, I'm going to show you the research that was conducted that says that there really hasn't been any sustained protests based on our lack of following a protocol. The research indicates that few protests have been filed, and so that's promising. So let's get into the slides here. I thought I'd give you that backdrop because I had so many questions yesterday when people downloaded the research. So we actually, it's framed by the understanding that traditional FAR techniques can be ineffective at acquiring innovative solutions for a variety of reasons. And so what the research team wanted to do was look at opportunities and flexibilities of CSOs to acquire innovative solutions and answer the following questions. And so these were the research questions that the students that Rene and I advised asked. What are CSO's strengths as a solicitation technique? What are the weaknesses? What are best practices? And is there a statistical difference in the lead times for contracts awarded from a CSO versus traditional FAR-based methodologies? And what can we draw from those inferences? So how they constructed the methodology, in a nutshell, they did a couple analytical areas. The first was to look at the CSO crosstalk meetings that had been established to talk about this protocol, and in essence is like an after-action report to gather the information. How did we do it? What worked? What problems did we face? And so there were several of these crosstalk meetings that had been documented, and the team actually got those and then decided to put them into specific category bins, including training, information sharing, internal agency process or protocols, solicitation definition, and industry interaction. And then the second piece that they did was look at the Federal Procurement Data System data to determine if there in fact was a statistical difference between the PALT on traditional FAR-based and this. And we'll get into a little bit of that. Somebody may recognize this. One of the issues with FPDS came up yesterday in another presentation. Okay. So the team then categorized the crosstalks into specific bins of strengths and weaknesses: training, information, internal agency processes, solicitation, and industry interaction. And of note here, my slide looks a little different. DIUX has realized a noticeable decrease in their acquisition timelines using CSOs. And so there is a marker out there that says this is a huge time saver. But as I'll show later on in one of the recommendations, the FPDS system doesn't have data fields that would allow us to track very accurately from requirements inception to the point that they get the solicitation, to the point it's awarded and then ultimately closed out. So if we look at the FPDS and the contract action reporting data system, there's some data fields that the team recommends be added to that, and they very, very specifically, I'll show you those at the end of the presentation. So what happened? 66 individual observations of strengths, weaknesses, and best practices. With those observations, they binned these into 27 strengths identified in the CSOs, 7 weaknesses, and 43 best practices. And again, few protests have been filed, and none have been sustained that were filed based on the CSO process. So, you know, if we think back, what is the #1 rationale for a sustained protest? The government not following its own criteria. And so, you know, because this is so loosely structured, we define what the criteria is when we issue this type of solicitation, and we follow those rules closely because we made the rules. The next slide here actually shows, I wish that was a little bit more legible, the actual bins. Some of the data actually stratified 2 columns. So if a CSO crosstalk came in, it might have been a strength, and there also might have been some identified weaknesses on that same crosstalk. You can see that the ones that have a huge number of strengths is process flexibility. It gives us the ability to do things we otherwise couldn't do or be lockstepped into a FAR Part 15 methodology. Other things, look at the solicitation definition, industry interaction, expanded solution horizons, participation, etc. Clearly, CSO strengths outweigh the negatives. And CSO, I want to emphasize the bottom of that one, can be used to identify innovative means to accomplish operations sustainment, even maintenance tasks. So it's not just relegated to, you know, acquiring hardware, software. It can actually be used for innovative maintenance on advanced weapon systems. And so this may help us reduce life cycle costs. And then one of the things I know in the amphib fleet, they're struggling with keeping those ships active and mission capable. So this may be an area where they can apply this. Here's the recommendations. Don't worry, I'm almost done. The Federal Procurement Data System modification, they made 2 specific recommendations. First, include solicitation technique as a reporting criteria, and to have a drop-down menu that actually indicates we use the CSO technique. That way it's easy to go in and do a data search for all those things that are going to happen. And I hope this takes off like wildfire, so there'd be more than just, you know, 66 of these things or 120 of these. There could be thousands of these to search. Second, include initial proposal receipt date as one of the reporting criteria, in addition to other data fields that are in the thesis. Expand the contract type options to include time and material. Yes, I said that. For use in CSOs, expand the language of Section 803 to expand the contract types. Formal training through, and I'm going to add Naval Postgraduate School and Defense Acquisition University. You know, get the word out, you know, on how this gets, how we construct these, how we utilize it. Get some subject matter experts in there to help teach and facilitate classwork. Invest in Commercial Solutions Opening Center of Excellence, and that actually happened already. That's at the Air Force. Address resource strain through organizational structuring and have separate CSO divisions and additional personnel trained up in this. I call them performance cells, performance branches that can actually specialize in this, and so when your agency or service has a vexing problem, they can say, I don't have the specialty to do it, but I know where I can get it, and our service has it. And so, for example, in the Air Force, they're going to go to the Air Force Center. Publication of requirements and industry involvement expands beyond traditional means. And then utilizing the Contract Business Analysis Repository, the CBAR, which has been around for, I guess, 12 years now, to actually put in the pre-solicitation and the analysis of the proposals that come in, and then the actual performance of those proposals. We already do that for everything over $25 million. I think this would be a good candidate to have in that type of a database. And the last thing, and I say this across anything that the government gets involved in, don't over-regulate this. How many people remember FAR 13.5? And it was a test pilot program for certain commercial items, and they raised the monetary threshold. As an example, the Navy had a 15-page checklist to determine whether or not a buyer should use that, and the checklist took people 2 full work days to get all the information put on it. Absolutely insane. So keep this simple. It's supposed to be simple. It's supposed to be flexible for us. Let's keep it that way. And that's all I've got.
Thanks, Cory. Let's go to Kelly.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So certainly happy to be a part of the discussion today. And a little bit of background, I spent about 15 years in Air Force contracting. Prior to that, I spent about 8 years in the infantry. And what's even more interesting, I think I deployed more when I was in contracting. And I had I think I was 6'2" and had a full head of hair before I understood contracting. So as we walk through this today, we'll talk a little bit about contracting from the perspective of the efficacy of optimized government, industry, academia co-education for major weapon systems, cost and price analysis, and contract negotiations. So at the end of the day, what happens if we do this together as opposed to doing it separately? Okay, and we'll talk more about that as we get through this. So as we've gone through the research symposium up to this point, I think everyone is well aware of the dynamics of the 21st century national security environment and the role that major weapon systems play in that, right? So we have to have the major weapon systems in order to do national security really well. The issue is buyer and sellers, although we look at velocity as the emerging metric, we both have to do things faster. Beneath the defense acquisition system or the subsystems, we have this idea of education, training, and practice. So these things help to support the larger defense acquisition system. Well, buyers and sellers typically have variations in the way that we educate, the way that we train, the way that we practice, and ultimately, these variations, they converge and manifest in the execution domain when it's very difficult because of the mission pressures that we're dealing with. The current ecosystem of education, training, and practice doesn't really provide opportunities for joint education, training, and practice. In other words, we do these things separately. Well, about 77 major defense acquisition programs deal with this across 71 buying offices. So when we think about the execution domain, it's very difficult to resource innovation when everyone's under mission pressure. One of the things I talk about with students is that if you have 100% of the mission in the execution domain, you are 65% staffed in the execution domain. How do you expect to identify and adopt anything that's innovative at the time? So innovation is very difficult in the execution domain. So one of the things we thought about with this study, for example, when we look at the difficulties, sellers, on one hand, they use a proposal development software called ProPricer Contractor Edition, where it's a one-to-many relationship database that deals with rates, it deals with tasks, basis of estimates, everything that one would need to develop a proposal. And on the government side, sometimes we use our own Excel spreadsheets. Right? So if you think about those different education, training, and practice paths that lead to execution, you can see where the friction points might arise during execution when we're supposed to be going faster. So instead of looking at resourcing innovation in the execution domain, the question is, what might happen if we resource innovation earlier in the process, in the education, training, and practice domains? So this qualitative study looked to understand and explore the participants' perceptions, participants being graduate students at the Naval Postgraduate School, We also brought in individuals from a major weapons systems program office in the Midwest, as well as buyers and sellers from that program office. And we wanted to ask the question, what happens if we started this idea of co-education together? Earlier, we talked about the benefits of culture. We also talked about the relationship between culture and innovation. One question remains is, well, where does culture start? Culture usually starts at the beginning. I think of basic training. I think about the Army. I think about the Marine Corps. It's how we start together and how that actually impacts our ability to do it better in the execution domain. So in this case, we brought buyers and sellers as well as students into one domain at the Naval Postgraduate School, and we looked at using pro-price or government edition as the platform from which to walk through the sole source contracting negotiations process. So in the course, we looked at, so if you look at the slides here from steps 1 to 12, you'll see steps 1 through 4 grayed out and then step 12 grayed out. So the focus of the course was from looking at the time we receive proposals, we conduct fact-finding, buyers and sellers complete price negotiation memorandums. Now, I know typically sellers don't do that, right? But at the same time, since most of these are buyers anyway, it's about getting that practice in. So steps 5 through 11 was the focus of the course, and the main question was, how do participants perceive the usefulness of doing this together? Not only government buyers and sellers, but also the next generation of acquisition leaders, the next generation of contracting officers. What happens if we all get together in the classroom using a common operating picture to work through this thing called cost and price analysis and contract negotiations? So government industry coeducation leverages a theory, it's called the triple helix theory. And what it postulates is that innovation in a knowledge-based economy lies in the interaction between the university, industry, and government. So it's where those things interact, when they interact, and then how we benefit from those things is what's most important. Industry is the production hub. I think we've talked about the industrial base earlier today. Government, as we know, establishes the contractual relationship, and hopefully academia, with the right inputs, will produce new technology and new knowledge. So at the intersection of government, industry, and academia is where we reside with today's study. So some of the participants, we had 13 U.S. Army students, 9 U.S. Navy students, 3 Marines, 2 U.S. Air Force students, 2 government buyers from the program office, and then 2 sellers from the OEM. And as we look at the years of experience, about 83% of the class had less than 1 year of experience, so most of these were students. But I'd also like you to pay attention to the fact that we had one individual with more than 25, well, between 21 to 25 years of experience, and then another individual between 16 to 20 years of experience, and then finally a buyer with between 1 and 5 years of experience. So I'm a firm believer in that if you have reasonable people in the same room with reasonable information, you will normally produce reasonable outcomes. So that's kind of the premise behind using a common operating picture for cost and price analysis instead of sellers only using ProPricer and buyers only using spreadsheets. Now, these are some of the results that came out of the survey. Now, I didn't capture all 20 questions. These are just some selected excerpts from the results. But what I'd like you to pay attention to is that buyer and seller ecosystem variations exist. So what this confirmed was that Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, buyers, and sellers, we all do contracting differently. When it's time to execute, it makes it even more difficult when we haven't had the right training or education to back that up. So I spent some time in the Joint Contracting Command Iraq, Afghanistan back in 2006, and we brought in Navy, Army, Coast Guard, and Marines into the Joint Contracting Command, and we expected them to operate as though we have educated and trained jointly prior to that. Well, that didn't happen. You can't get jointness in the execution domain if you don't deal with jointness in the education, training, and practice domains prior to that. So what this information did for us is that it confirmed that, yes, all of the participants believe that, yes, we do this differently. Here's the other interesting perspective that came out of the study, was that 50% strongly disagreed, 11% someone disagreed, and 20% disagreed that education, training, and practice variations do not negatively affect our ability to conduct major weapon systems, cost and price analysis, and contract negotiations. So it shows that even though we do it differently, we understand that these variations certainly can affect the outcomes. Well, when we put buyers and sellers together along with students, what we found was that it minimizes these variations because we start off on the same footing, I should say, and we work through the process together. So government, industry, academia, coeducation minimizes these variations. And not only that, when we look at statement 11 there, 67% of the respondents strongly agreed, 6% somewhat agreed, and 28% agreed that going through this process increases individual competence. So we understand buyer and seller perspectives at the very beginning in the education, training, and practice domains before we get to the execution domain. So I'm not going to read all of these, but then the final one I want to highlight is this idea of trust, collaboration, and innovation. It's hard to build trust in the execution domain if you haven't had that experience prior to that. It's not a matter of when we partner, because eventually we're going to partner. But if we have the wherewithal at the very beginning to partner in education, training, and practice using a common operating picture to help influence what we do in the execution domain. So the good news is that buyers and sellers from different backgrounds, students, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines from different backgrounds, all agreed, or most of them agreed, that when you put industry in the same room with buyers and students, that it creates the condition for forging and enhancing trust relationships between buyers and sellers. Not only that, 67% of the respondents strongly agreed, 28% somewhat agreed, and then 6% agreed that government-industry coeducation creates the environment for buyer and seller collaboration and the conditions for innovation. Part of what we do in academia is this idea of critical thinking. Well, critical thinking is comprised of two parts, right? So you have systems one thinking and then systems two thinking. Halpern talks about this in one of her books. Systems two is very slow and deliberate. Systems one relies on systems two. I like to talk about this with students from the perspective of playing piano. You can't become proficient at playing piano on day one, and you can't be expected to improvise without knowing scales, chord progressions, and practicing. So systems two deals with practicing before you can actually do the improvisation. Well, you can't practice as well in the execution domain on stage when it's time to play. You have to do that well before you get there. So what government industry coeducation does, it allows us to do systems two thinking very critically. We make mistakes so that once we get to the execution domain, hopefully things will be smoother by that time. Okay. So here's some comments from some of the students, as well as from some of the senior buyers that participated. So just one or two comments here. Look at I'll go with number 2 there. Incorporation of industry and external acquisition professionals provides unique insight into the challenges we face outside the classroom. Using new and innovative contract pricing tools was enlightening, and I saw that progress can be made in efficiency and effectiveness. Okay, so that was one piece of it. Comment number 10 there. Interacting with pro-pricer and industry partners was eye-opening. It highlights the complexity of the issues we will likely face when we return to the field. Okay, and then finally, from a senior buyer with roughly 25 years of experience, this person's perspective was, hey, if I would have had this when I first started, things would have been a lot easier. And you're talking 25 years ago. And then from the course itself, when you look at the course evaluation scores overall, students agreed that they learned a great deal in terms of their ability to critically think, as well as their analytical capabilities. And then overall, the course was designed very well from the student's perspective. So when you look at the cogs there, or the gears, you see education, training, practice, and then execution. Typically, buyers, sellers, industry, and government, we do these things separately. So what happens when we have the right touch points in the right place at the right time? What is education's impact on execution? What is training's impact on execution? And then what is practice's impact on execution? It's hard to know if they're not measured, but if you put those things together, and then you can bring the execution, if you will, into the training and education and practice domains. I call it, let's bring the reality of the mission area back to the classroom, then students will engage with what they're typically going to encounter once they get to the mission area. Most of us who are prior service Army, we say train as you fight. Right, so we did a lot of this in the classroom before we actually have to do it. So here are some of the conclusions. Buyer and seller variations do exist, so the information did confirm that. We also realize that this approach, it can minimize the variations within the ecosystem, education, training, and practice ecosystems. Deming stated that everyone benefits from an optimized system. So if we can optimize cost and price analysis in contract negotiations, perhaps then we can optimize the way that we do contracts. And if we can lock in rates and we can lock in agreements, what Deming says is that stockholders, suppliers, internal customers, external customers, all of us can benefit from an optimized system. So one of the recommendations, or two I should say, that I have, is that we had a limited sample of buyers and sellers in the office. So 2 from the program office, from the buying side, and then 2 from the selling side. I think it's important to expand opportunities to industry, to invite them into the classroom and go through this perhaps 1 or 2 more times, so that we can actually strengthen the findings and then confirm the findings. So the last recommendation here is, before I talked about bringing the realities of the classroom, or bringing the realities of the mission area to the classroom, this last recommendation does the reverse of that. It brings the realities of the classroom back to the mission area. So in the classroom, we dealt with steps 5 through 11, from receipt of proposal to receiving contract clearance and approval. The recommendation here is to go to a program office that doesn't currently use ProPricer and work through all 12 steps, measuring the baseline of what the organization does today without a common operating picture, and then measuring that against what might happen if we actually use a common operating picture. So with that, I would end with this. Again, if you have reasonable people in the same room with reasonable information, you will normally have reasonable outcomes. If all are unreasonable, then you have nothing at the end. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Kelly. All right, so while we wait to ask questions and see if anybody has them in the chat or in the room, I'm gonna start us off. I'm gonna go back to you, Rene. Based on your research, and some of this is also just kind of your thoughts. Non-FAR instruments aren't always the fastest timeline. So what advice do you have for our audience to help them combat this assumption, and instead to focus on outcomes, return on investment of their time, while still encouraging innovation?
Right, so when I hear non-FAR instruments aren't the fastest timelines, I think it's because we're not very familiar with how to process those non-FAR instruments. We, in our research, we found that seasoned FAR-trained contracting officers were challenged with using PIAs because they weren't familiar with non-FAR contracting processes, or what I would normally call contracting processes. Not all contracting is in the FAR, and there's more to contracting than just what's in the FAR. So I think in order to be innovative and to get to innovative outcomes, you discussed, educating for change earlier this morning, and being aware of tools that exist to help implement change. The PIA is a tool that exists to implement change. It's a tool that we could use to help technology transfer and technology transition between the government and industry. And I think what makes that tool successful is that it's not a FAR-based contracting instrument. The challenge there is to become competent in non-FAR contracting processes so that we can reduce the timeline if, in fact, non-FAR instruments results in a longer timeline. But our case study at the Air Force Global Strike Command, and so for those of you that aren't familiar with Air Force Global Strike Command, they're the MAGCOM that works on, that's focused on strategic deterrence and strategic capabilities. Think of bombers like B-1s, B-2s, B-52s, ICBMs, as well as all of the other combat support aircraft and services that support Global Strike Command's mission. So the PIA at the Air Force Global Strike Command has become very, very successful. In 2022, it resulted in a $248 million return on investment by identifying solutions for various areas like the B-52 air refueling trainer system and the B-52 ejection seat cable system. And so these are like real world, real application acquisition outcomes that we were able to get to, I believe, in a more timelier fashion by using a non-FAR instrument. And the challenge there is educating for change and educating to be comfortable, to get out of our comfort zone, to use non-FAR instrument. I think this goes back to Kelly's thing about education, training, and practice, and making that support the execution. So that's my answer for that. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Rene. Yeah, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable in some of these vehicles that are out there, that just because we haven't used them doesn't mean that there isn't something that we could use. So thinking a little bit differently. So Cory, I'm going to come to you. Again, CSOs not so well understood. How do we spread awareness? And you said your co-authors, Eric Washburn and Mary Beth, may be on the line. So similar to Rene's, with CSOs, again, aren't always the fastest to execute, but what advice do you have for the audience to encourage their use, experiment, know what their return on investment is that they're looking for, so that the team can kind of go after this in a different way of what the outcomes the team needs to achieve?
I think there's, I teach learning curve in one of my classes, and I tell people it's really hard when you do it the first time, because there's a learning curve to learning curve. You know, it takes a while to figure out how do we do these, how do we construct them, how do we interpret them. I think it's the same thing here. You know, business entities within DoD could internally try their own pilot programs to test out these protocols and to you know, see what works for them. And I like to say that success breeds success. So if they can see this application working for them, I think it's going to catch on like wildfire, because Eric and Mary Beth have, if you look at their bio, they're in the thick of using these things and many other tools very successfully. And I think it's that level of success as the word gets out, as education on these gets out, like Kelly says, get it out there. I think we're going to see it more widely adapted. Think about when OTs first came in line, you know, way back. They were restricted. People didn't know how to use them. They were afraid of them. They were afraid of protests resulting from them. A lot of that didn't turn out to manifest, but the authority got expanded and expanded and expanded, so now it's common parlance. We talk about it all the time, that is an instrument we can use, and we use it effectively. And I think it's the same thing with the CSO. I think people just need to get practiced in it, get some of that success, and I think it's going to catch on. I hope.
All right, and keep encouraging it. I like how the CSO Center of Excellence has been created too. So your recommendations are already taking flight, so to speak. Yeah. All right, so Kelly, I'm going to move to you, and I love how you talked about this friction point between innovation, resources, and the need for speed. So my question to you is, of the 31 participants across all services with government buyers and sellers, you guys integrated quite productively in the education environment. So what thoughts, again, do you have for the audience to think how to scale these integration efforts and that co-education, the benefits of that you saw? How do you scale that outside of the classroom?
Good question, ma'am, and it's something that we actually thought about at the very beginning. So the delivery mode of the classroom is primarily in resident, but we also record all of the sessions. So we had individuals that did participate at different times. If you remember or recall, I think it was comment 11, and the person said, basically, I watched the video that you did, and I noticed that, hey, if I had ProPricer earlier, this would have been a lot easier for me. So it's about awareness of what's available, and then getting in contact with me in the Naval Postgraduate School, and we can set up courses like this where we can set up those hybrid delivery modes so that we can actually do the education, training, and practice together so that we can hopefully execute better. And then the final thing I'll say is, not only did buyer and seller have different perspectives that they learned from each other and learned with each other, but also the students. So the next generation of acquisition and contracting officers, they're sitting in the same room with folks that are doing the business today, learning from those things in an environment where they can actually think. They can actually make mistakes with that information and then go through active experimentation when we go through contract negotiations and actually learn from it before they get to the mission area. So come to us. We can certainly set something up for you if that's something that you want to do, and we can set it up so that we can deliver it both in resident and distance learning.
All right. Thanks, Kelly. All right. Did we have any questions there in the room? Okay. All right. Let's get you guys the microphone.
Hi, Eileen Rubel, Software Engineering Institute. I really enjoyed the discussion of the government, industry, academia, co-education. I'm wondering, does your survey mechanism include instrumentation of follow-up, in particular with the students once they've left the academic program and they are in their first jobs? Is there a time frame where we're following up with them to say, hey, are you actually using this in your day-to-day job, or what have you implemented?
Yeah, so that would be the next phase of the research. Right now, we have not looked at that, but certainly as we look at bringing the realities of the classroom to the mission area, that's exactly what we're going to do as a follow-on effort.
I'm Mike McGrath from ERIC, the Acquisition Innovation Research Center, and I have a question about PIAs. So a few years ago, as part of a National Academy study that looked at various industry R&D consortia, and Army, Navy, and Air Force had non-FAR agreements that functioned, as you described, similar to an IDIQ contract. In some cases, these were cooperative agreements, some were PIAs, some were other transaction agreements. And so my question is, how do you decide which form to use outside the FAR?
Right, so that's a very good question. A lot of the decision will be what authorities does the organization have? Certain authorities, certain organizations, agencies have OT authorities, but they may not have P authorities. Within the Air Force, it's the Air Force Research Lab that specifically has the authority to establish the PIAs, because the PIAs are specifically for T3 services, so technology transfer and transition services. So I think my first step would be, what authorities does my organization, does my agency have? Can I use, CRADAs? Can I use OTs? Can I use PIAs? Can I use TIAs? That's TIA, that's another one. And if your agency doesn't have the authority and you want that authority, maybe try to get the authority to use those instruments, or use the instruments that you have the authority to do, or that you have to execute those instruments. And then the second step after that would be, and then provide some education or training on how to use those instruments, those non-FAR instruments.
Howdy. You talked about using ProPricer for having that common operating picture when you're developing a lot of things. And one thing that struck me was doing IGEs. One of the things, I see that being a macro solution, but on the micro scale, we already do this in a lot of ways within the unit level, using RS means and E4 clicks for construction estimates. However, more times than not, they are wildly inaccurate, and we end up folding to the information that the contractor submitted. And many times this is developed by engineers who have been working within the organization 10, 20-ish years that have supervised level. So what are your recommendations to combat this inability of the people that support us in building these price proposals? I am not an expert in construction management and how to price construction projects. So what are your recommendations to combat that?
Yeah, so I think it's important to make the distinction between FAR Part 36 requirements for construction and then FAR Part 34 for major weapon systems, right? So the major weapon system piece there is, we rely heavily upon industry when we go through the requirements planning process, and we look at rough orders of magnitude or budgetary estimates, and hopefully beyond that, we get to work breakdown structures, tasks, and then ultimately the BOEs. So if we do requirements planning well enough, we're all in the same room with the contractor's information, and then we tend to understand that information if we're all looking at it at the same time. Now, when it comes down to FAR Part 36 and, RS means and all those parts and pieces, I think that's a tougher hill to climb. But one thing that I would recommend is that history is a good indicator, right? So if you go back and look at similar projects, look at both the technical and contractual history. Are we buying similar things from similar contractors? And how did we approach that? That could serve as a baseline. But without that history, then it's anyone's guess as to what those numbers actually mean. So did that help, or did that muddy the water for you?
You say look at previous information, but the engineers and the pricers that have been developing this have been there for a extended period of time already, and they are still missing the mark.
So are they doing the same things wrong, or are they actually looking at the data and making decisions based on new information, or what's kind of the case
So
there?
there's Phillips' opinion, and then there's Master Napier's opinion.
Okay.
My personal opinion is that they're throwing wet spaghetti and seeing what sticks to the wall to get that wag. And the professional opinion is that they don't know what they're doing and that they are wildly incompetent.
Okay, well, tell us how you really feel about it. So the only thing I would say then to that is it goes back to how then are the outcomes of that process feeding back into education and training? In other words, if we look at this as an output and we're getting the wrong output each and every time, well, maybe we should take that back to education and training and break it apart, and let's see if we can put the right inputs in. So just my perspective.
Thanks, Kelly. And thanks for that question. I think it kind of digs out, even what Kelly's researching is the trust. How do you build that trust? So we're not always talking about academia, industry, and the government. Sometimes we're talking about internal within the government. How do we communicate with our own functionals? And then how do we kind of try to get into that shared space so that we can actually be on the same page and have the same common operating picture. So I think that's a ripe area for exploration. Now I think is there anybody else in the room with questions? All right, I see a hand. We have about 5 minutes. So I'm going to take this last question. Please don't ask a PhD question. I want to go back to each of our panelists so that they can give their closing thoughts.
Yes, ma'am.
No pressure, sir.
Jay Barlow, my question is for Professor Yoder. I wanted to ask, so CSO use the merit systems in terms of how they evaluate the actual solicitation and the work. Can you just briefly touch on it? You touched on it very lightly.
Yeah, so So the criteria that we can use, it can be a little bit less structured because we don't have a statement of work, we don't have a performance work statement, so we don't have a lot of detail in what it is we want. We've got a vexing problem, we've identified the problem, we're seeking solutions to that problem from industry. So we use subject matter experts to help us craft the criteria that we can identify, hey, that's a solution that we think is going to work here. And so we also use those subject matter experts to help in that evaluation process and communicating with the contractors to make sure that we understand what their approach is going to be. So I think it gives us that flexibility. You want to get back to something Kelly said. During that process, we have kind of a common operating picture to say, you know, have you properly identified the problem, even though we, the government, don't know the solution? Has that contractor addressed how that can be solved? And I think that the SMEs play that key pivotal role in there in making that decision. What's great is we don't have to compare the proposals that come in against each other. We compare them based on the merits. And so if we find one that we think is going to work and we can set the target ceiling on the price and everything else the way we want it, and structure it the way we want it, we can make that award. I think one of the hallmarks that I didn't mention is that oftentimes innovative industries don't want to play with us because of intellectual property rights. And if we go the OT route, we can actually protect some of those rights and build that trusting relationship with those vendors so that they'll actually want to play with us and give us solution sets that are going to solve our problems. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thanks for that, Cory. Yeah, I think we could do an entire panel on intellectual property. That's near and dear to my heart as well. And I think that's also an area of shared opportunity we have for establishing trust. My thoughts on that, just for, is making sure that we're asking for what we need and knowing what we need before we ask for unlimited data rights. And so our IP cadre in the Department of the Air Force really works on that with our SAF GCQ folks. So I'm going to wrap us up, and then I'm going to go to Rene, Cory, and Kelly. You all, with your research and your co-authors, encouraged us to explore, experiment, and dive into and really educate ourselves on some of these alternate acquisition authorities that are out there and methodologies and really ways to establish trust. So thank you for your research and your leadership. And with that, if I can go to each member for about 30 seconds, and then we'll close up the panel. Thank you.
So I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to present and for you all for attending. This whole session was about being innovative and innovative approaches to contracting, and that involves being comfortable with being uncomfortable, as the general said. And being uncomfortable is thinking outside the FAR. And there's a lot of innovation that can come from being outside the FAR. We just need to learn those innovative processes. What I talked about, the PIA contracting process aligns very well with the contract management standard that's been published by the National Contract Management Association. It's not the FAR, it's the contract management principles of how contracts are run. Be comfortable with being outside the FAR, and that's my suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to state that CSO is something that we've been asking for, just like when OTs first came around and Fair and Fast came around in the late 90s. It was protocols that we were asking for. Now it's been given to us. So don't go out and say, yeah, I saw something last year. It was on CSOs. That was very interesting, and have a cup of tea and leave it at that. Go out and talk to people, talk to your offices, talk to your branches, and figure out ways that you can get this stuff implemented at your own service commands and spread the word on it. I think overall, when we look at the nature of the problems that we're currently facing, agility, innovation, reduction of costs, we've got tools at our disposal to help with these things. And so 21 years coming here to the Acquisition Symposium, when I keep hearing, hey, we're over budget, we don't have enough money, this, that, and the other thing, we're too slow. Well, Congress heard us, and they're giving us a solution set here. So let's adapt it and go out and be a cheerleader just like I am.
I think they heard you next door, Cory.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So just some final thoughts. I believe it's not that we're not doing good things. We're just not doing good things together. There are pockets of innovation all over the system, but there's limited awareness of what that looks like. So I think the more we can come together in environments where we have government, industry, and academia together, we can learn from each other at the very beginning. So we ask this question, where do we resource innovation? Well, throughout the system. But there's probably a better place to do it, and that's at the beginning. So I think where we start is going to certainly affect how we finish and where we finish. So that's all I have, ma'am, and thank you all.
All right, those are excellent. So congratulations to our researchers. All right, I think that concludes the session. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon and awesome. Excellent thoughts.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your help.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, guys.